Hello and welcome. Why is the political climate in the United States so heated up, leading to the midterm elections? An angry and often vicious campaign has exacerbated divisions not only between Democratic and Republican voters, but also among Republicans themselves. And that has led to the emergence of a controversial new force calling itself the Tea Party, a name referring back to the so-called Boston Tea Party, where American colonialists physically rebelled in Boston Harbor against a British-imposed tax on tea. The Tea Party is an ultra-right-wing movement dedicated to smaller government, lower taxes and less spending. It has consistently opposed President Barack Obama's policies such as healthcare overhaul, the bailout of banks and financial reform. Meanwhile, those on the political left are also upset with President Obama, saying he has not gone far enough in restructuring healthcare or regulating big business, despite having large Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. So today we ask, could the bitter political polarization between liberals and conservatives trigger a prolonged political stalemate in the US? Remember, you can call in with your questions and comments, and we also welcome your SMS texts and emails on the show. Well, joining me now is Max Pappas of Freedom Works, a conservative organization that mobilizes volunteers to fight for less government, and David Swanson of Democrats.com, a progressive group that supports the Democratic Party. He's also author of the book Daybreak, Undoing the Imperial Presidency and Forming a More Perfect Union. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David, if I could start with you. A lot of people have been coming down very hard on Barack Obama in the run-up to the midterms. The main arguments he's failed to deliver on his campaign promises. And I wonder, doesn't that put the Democrats running in this midterm election in a difficult position?
It certainly does. I mean, this enthusiasm gap is not just because of the Tea Party inspiring people on the right. It's because of the Democrats not doing what people on the left want, and in fact what a majority of people in the country want. This president could have come in and cleaned house and prosecuted his predecessors for crimes and ended the wars and ended the spying and ended the abuses. They could have thrown out the filibuster rule and put through real healthcare reform, a real system of Medicare for all. They could have given us the right to organize in the workplace. They could have really inspired and put the enthusiasm on their side. Instead, they let everybody down, including people who are in the Tea Party, people across the political spectrum who want the system reformed in ways that neither party will talk about, so it's not in the election debate. Everybody wants a reform to this broken system.
Although just 2 years in, it's not a lot of time, and also it's not as simple, surely, as those things you said. Because of the lobbying, because of the manacles that the office has, it's surely limits to what he could actually do.
I don't know. I mean, a president who, without help from Congress or the courts or anyone, can declare it the policy now to assassinate Americans as long as they're abroad, and that becomes the law of the land, has pretty strong powers. This is a president who could have refrained from telling the Justice Department to let the torturers off the hook, to give immunity to the corporations who helped with the warrantless spying. It would be possible for one party or the other to campaign against this unprecedented corruption of corporate money, to campaign against the restrictions on ballot access, the gerrymandering that will be redone this year, these reforms that are needed by people across the political spectrum, but are not being advanced by the Tea Party, which is puts itself out as a grassroots movement. It's funded from corporations and very wealthy donors with a corporate agenda that goes against what the majority of the people in it even want.
Well, Max Pappas, let me ask you about that. What does make this election different, this midterm election, is the prominence of the Tea Party, and everyone's talking about it, of course. It's very much in the media. Do you feel that's going to translate at the polls?
Well, I think we're going to see a historic election. I think you're going to see new voters turn out at a level that we haven't seen in decades. Now, I agree with a number of things that David was talking about, like problems with the imperial presidency, the title of your book. Too much executive power is something that would certainly be in line with concerns of the Tea Party movement. Shenanigans like gerrymandering districts, which is where you draw funny lines to make sure your guy wins. It's antithetical to the democracy. But what was inaccurate was the characterization that the Tea Party movement is somehow funded by corporate interests. This is a very broad grassroots uprising that, frankly, there isn't enough money in politics to pay for. I mean, this is millions of Americans who are empowered largely by the technologies of the internet, which have made it dramatically cheaper for them to engage in political action. That's how they're getting involved. There's more information out there. There's more networks. There's Al Jazeera network. There's all sorts of cable networks and other sources of news where people are getting their information from. And they're now also using the internet to connect with their members of Congress. They're finding out what's going on, and they're being heard. It's going to be historic.
I'll get a little more onto that in a moment, but let me ask you, about this criticism about Barack Obama not achieving very much. I mean, 2 years again, I put it to you, in 2 years, what could he do? And if you think about it, is there an alternative? Would anyone have done anything really in a different way, do you think?
Well, I would actually say that he's achieved too much. He's passed a couple of very large pieces of legislation. It's rare for one 2,000-page piece of legislation to get passed. He passed two, and in the House he also got the cap and trade bill through one level of Congress. That's a lot of legislation. What I wish they would have done would have been to see the uprising that the health care bill created and understood just how upset that was making people. I think if that was the case, the Democrats wouldn't be losing nearly as many seats as they're going to lose today. This is largely a policy opposition that we're seeing today. People understand the policies that are presented, they don't like them, and they're voting the people out who passed them. And a lot of the people who in Congress who used unusual tactics to get their legislation through didn't seem very transparent or very open. And I think the people in this era of the internet want more transparency and openness.
David Swanson, an email to you, if I may, sir. It's from Ken Kigalu in Kenya, who wrote in, commenting on the way politics have become in the USA. And he says, Republicans are attacking Obama for not fulfilling his promises, yet they're the ones opposing and trying to block every legislative change he tries to make. And there is that feeling that it's become so obstructive now that the Republicans turn around and oppose pretty much everything the Democrats are doing. And I wonder, what does simply opposing anything that one party says actually achieve? Surely it comes down to a stalemate.
Well, many of them are opposing him for having been born in Kenya. The emailer apparently doesn't want to raise that point, but it's true that they have been blocking. You have over 400 bills that have passed the House that are sitting there waiting to be passed in the Senate because the Democrats have chosen to leave the Republicans in power with this filibuster rule. So we're going to see the Republican majority of 41 maybe grow to a majority of 46 or something. The problem is that you have minority rule there, and you're enabling that rule by keeping that filibuster rule in place. I think that it's absolutely right that we're going to see gridlock. And we're going to see gridlock despite the majority of Americans across this divide agreeing on all kinds of necessary reforms and agreeing on opposition to these wars, which are not talked about in this election, which are not talked about in all of these so-called grassroots movements demanding an end to spending. Cut spending, cut spending. But the single biggest piece of spending and the most destructive piece of spending that a majority of Americans want cut, and they won't touch it because it's not a grassroots movement. It's very closely controlled.
Well, Max, I want to get your response, but also it's easy to sit within the Beltway and talk about the mechanism of the way government works here. But for the average American, it comes down to those policies, as you say, people are deciding on. What do you think are and responding also to what David said, what do you think are the three major issues that might be swaying voters now then?
Well, I think the Tea Party movement was really the spark that lit the movement, I would say, was the Wall Street bailout that the Democratic-controlled Congress and the Republican presidency, this is the end of the Bush administration, passed. There was 100-to-1 calls against that bill coming in from grassroots activists. And it made it very clear how much it's the political class versus the American people when you have the Democrats and the Republicans working together to bail out their allies in Wall Street. That, I think, people saw as the last straw. That's when things really kicked off. Then you have the health care vote. I think that was the second biggest one, where people said, how can we have a bill where 535 individuals in Washington, D.C. force us to buy a product sold by a private company? Never before has that happened in the United States. And that itself, that's the individual mandate, I think was seen as a step too far in government control in our lives. And the third one, it's hard to say if it's the $1 trillion stimulus bill that has failed to do anything for unemployment, or if it was the auto bailout, the government buying auto companies that just seemed not how a free market system should work, or maybe the cap and trade bill, where we were going to have these same unelected bureaucrats tell us what sort of light bulbs we can buy.
And yet there's a feeling also that if those measures weren't taken, the bailouts and all the stimulus package, that the country wouldn't be at least on the road to recovery, according to a lot of people. I mean, the jobs may not kick in straight away, but if it wasn't for these, that things would be worse.
I disagree. There's some interesting studies that have been done on the recession of the 80s versus the recessions of right now. And as a percentage of GDP, the tax cuts that President Reagan put in place were about the same size as the stimulus package is as a percentage of GDP. We're about 20 months out from the stimulus package being enacted. Unemployment is up about 2 million, 2.5 million since it was enacted. At the same time period since the tax cuts were put in place by Reagan, employment was up by about 7 million as a percent if you extrapolate for the same percentage of population. So that's the opposite direction by freeing the economy to do what it needs to do, leave the money in the people's pockets and let them take care of it.
I won't dwell on this, of course. We could look at the way the global picture has changed, but let me get David Swanson back in and ask. There's a feeling Democrats haven't really mobilized when it comes to this midterm election. That the election's almost been like taken out of the Democrats' hands. It's all been about the Tea Party and what the Republicans want. Why is that?
Well, the short answer is that the Tea Party has largely been driven by a corporate media outlet, Fox News, and other media that have promoted it in a way that real community groups and labor unions and grassroots groups don't have that advantage. But I think that the Democrats have failed. I agreed with just about everything that Max just said. But when you look at a horrible health insurance reform bill, the answer is not that they shouldn't have done anything and let the benevolent insurance companies take care of us. The answer is that if they had put through a real reform, like other wealthy nations of the world have, that people could have experienced in their lives. Now I have free preventive medicine from birth to death, then all of the cries of socialist evil would have been exactly identical, but people would have experienced a significant advantage from what the Democrats had done. Instead, they got the worst of both worlds. They got all the fanatical criticism without giving people a real reform that removed the heart of the problem, which is the for-profit health insurance companies.
Well, we're going to take a very short break here. Let me say when we return, we look at the way things have been going with the Tea Party and how the Tea Party has shaken up the Republican Party. Stay with us. Our debate will continue. Welcome back. The U.S. midterm elections have thrown up some of the most acrimonious campaigning in recent times between the Republicans and Democrats. So in this battle of left versus right, what are the implications for democracy in the USA? Well, I have with me conservative commentator Max Pappas, who's working with Freedom Works, a group that supports and endorses the policies of the Tea Party, and progressive blogger and author David Swanson of thedemocrats.com, an independent community of activists that supports the Democratic Party. And Max, on the issue of negative campaigning, it's some people say this has become one of the sort of roughest campaigns when, in terms of targeting opponents. Let's have a look at this campaign ad by Tea Party favorite Sharon Angle, who was running for Senate against Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. Many people say this one stokes fear against immigrants.
Waves of illegal aliens streaming across our border, joining violent gangs, forcing families to live in fear. And what's Harry Reid doing about it? Voting to give illegal aliens Social Security benefits, tax breaks, and college tuition. Voting against declaring English our national language twice. And even siding with Obama and the President of Mexico to block Arizona's tough new immigration law. Harry Reid, it's clear whose side he's on, and it's not yours.
Now, several of those claims in the ad are questionable, like Reid's promise to give illegal aliens tax breaks, and Reid voted against the amendment along with 21 Republicans. But I wonder if in a charged atmosphere, people are paying attention to facts like this, or whether it's just about getting the emotion out there.
Politics is ugly, and it's always been ugly. If you could look back to the first partisan contest in the United States, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, they slung nasty criticisms at each other. Adams was a blind, short, half-wit. If Jefferson got elected, rapists were going to be running in the streets. It's unfortunate that more time can't be spent on seriously talking about the issues. It happens every election.
It's got worse, though, hasn't it? Because I had Jimmy Carter on the show not long ago. He said in my day, things weren't quite so bad. We didn't
the
quite
past always seems better. Politics has been ugly for as long as politics has been around. Ask Julius Caesar.
Yeah, David Swanson, a thought from you on why things have gone this way, though, in terms of direct, less about the policies perhaps, and more about what the other guy has done wrong.
Well, there's never been less useful substantive commentary in between the commercials, and there's never been more of the commercials, and there's never been more money put into buying those commercials off our airwaves by a smaller group representing a plutocracy in this country that funds a lot of this. And it's incredibly destructive. Sure, politics has always been ugly, but it's not excusable. We don't have to allow it. We can push back and we can demand a better direction. And to have an opinion about immigration policy is one thing, but to show an image of a young male, scruffy-looking man in apparently a prison situation to represent an entire population from a region of the globe, and to stoke fear with that, is beyond the pale. I mean, it's horrible, horrible politics.
Well, for our viewers who don't get to see a lot of these adverts, here's another one. This one's from Rick Barber, a Tea Party candidate during the Republican congressional primary in Alabama, where he equated modern taxation and social spending with slavery.
Okay. Hey, Abe. If someone's forced to work for months to pay taxes so that a total stranger can get a free meal, medical procedure, or a bailout, what's that called? What's it called when one man is forced to work for another?
Slavery. David, again, it's a sort of twist on ideas. Apparently, Abraham Lincoln was quite big on big government policies. I wonder, is there any accountability when it comes to making statements like this? Should there be more accountability?
Well, of course there should be. We should vote against anybody who makes statements like this, and we should reform this system so that we have free coverage for ballot qualified campaigns, and it's not an auction to the highest bidder, and we should have substantive and publicly funded and community funded information in between the commercials that gives us the relevant facts and does what we're doing here in critiquing these destructive ads and this idea that freedom, the thing that they supposedly hate us for and bomb us for, consists of not paying taxes, whereas other countries pay even higher taxes than we do, but get something for it. This is the problem with our taxes, that we don't get anything for our taxes except wars.
Now, yeah, Max, actually that's an interesting point, because of course people watching from overseas must see what's happening in the US as a circus. I mean, the US is trying to sort of export its democracy to other countries, according to some. They say, you're in Afghanistan and Iraq telling us how things should be, but then we look at your election and suddenly it's become this kind of circus as well. So surely it doesn't set a good example.
I think famous commentator from the early part of the last century, H.L. Mencken, was saying something right when he said that democracy is the only truly entertaining form of government. And this is democracy. It's messy. It's decentralized. No, there isn't a centralized control. So I think that you do get a lot of ugly, but you do get a lot of good as well. You have a system in which people actually do get to have a say in who sets the rules by which we must live.
Although often it's linked to money. But let me also ask you about this question that we got from a South African viewer who wrote in criticizing the Tea Party, Sandra Dixon, she wrote in saying, the Tea Party has its roots in anti-government fundamentalism and extreme religiosity. Shouldn't a more appropriate name for them be the Trojan Horse Party? I guess a lot of people are still confused about what the Tea Party really wants to achieve. There are some, like the lower spending and lower taxes and so on, but has it had a problem in trying to form a sort of a clear picture of what it wants to be?
I don't think so. I think it's pretty clear that the Tea Party is a diffuse network of individuals with their own groups all over the country that share a limited set of ideas on which they agree. They agree on the basic ideas of free markets, constitutionally limited government, and fiscal responsibility. There are a lot more issues out there, and I've talked to Tea Party leaders all over the country, and they come together on those three. On the many other issues, there's a broad diversity of opinion.
An email for you, actually, David, and this picks up on something you were talking about. From the USA, Linda Taylor wrote in saying, is it possible that the animosity between parties is a creation of the 24-hour cable news networks? And you mentioned the role of the media, certainly in the case of the Tea Party, but what role overall has the media played in this election, do you feel?
A huge role, and let me just comment that when Baghdad was being looted and our military was guarding the Ministry of Oil, our Secretary of War, Rumsfeld, said, well, democracy is messy. I don't think that's an excuse for anything. I do think that the media has a lot to blame, both for our wars, which Max, I think, is happy to fund, and an ever-growing military. They're
really?
happy to fund.
Did I ever say anything that gave you that impression? Have you ever read anything that I've written that said that? No. So please spare making assumptions on my positions.
No, please take my time and correct me. I would love to hear, because that would be a wonderful point of agreement, that we would like to address the single biggest area of spending our money. That this military that's as much spending as the rest of the world combined. Do you want to see that cut?
I think we need to look at all funding in the federal government for possibility for places to save money. We just did a poll at FreedomWorks where over 70% of the people support a broad 10% across the board cuts, and that's going to include some defense spending. I think there's waste everywhere that we can squeeze out.
Now, ironically, Max, an email that touches on this, ABS Ibra in the USA wrote in saying, Republicans had 8 years in office to prevent the global economic crisis we face today, but they lost control of the House and Senate in 2008. Republicans can do nothing but blame Democrats for a mess they didn't make. And yet one criticism that comes in is that President Obama has been too willing to keep the Bush policies going, for example, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I wonder, what choices do you think he had when he came to these conflicts?
He was the head of the executive branch and the head of the military, and he had a very large majority in both houses of Congress. So I think he had a fair amount of discretion. What we're more concerned about is we focus on the fiscal issues. We're concerned with his doubling down on the bad Bush economic policies, dramatic increases in spending. We thought it was bad when Bush had deficits about $500 billion, and now this president is signing bills with $1.5 trillion in deficit. Totally unacceptable.
David Swanson, just a minute to go, so a quick question for you. How do you regard the view that perhaps if the Republicans do manage to get a bit of power, it's in their hands whether they take one of the houses or not, it's a chance for them to be perhaps more cooperative. Now they have a chance to do something, they might be a little more responsible, and this might actually unlock the system a bit.
Well, you know, my concern is less for bipartisan harmony within the Congress than with what our policies are coming out of it. And if that can result from harmonious agreement between the two parties, great. If it is the result of one party overriding the other on behalf of the majority of Americans, then I'm all for that. And I'm extremely disappointed with how the Democrats have wasted the past 2 years. I have no expectations of good things coming out of the Republican House.
Well, of course, we're going to keep an eye on what's going on. I wanted to thank you, David Swanson, Max Pappas. Thank you very much for the debate.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us too. Now remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the topics and post your questions and comments. On the next show, is Myanmar preparing for war? As the military-led nation readies itself for its first election in 2 decades, tensions between the government and ethnic minority groups have been escalating. Just how free and fair will those elections be? Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.